USP Allenwood is a place most prisoners fear more than the sentence itself, a silent fortress where the walls don't just confine, they observe. Deep in rural Pennsylvania sits a high-security world built on secrets, steel, and stories officials never want told. Today, we unlock the doors and step into a prison so controlled, so calculated, that even chaos seems organized. Before we begin, if you love real, unfiltered stories from inside America's toughest prisons, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community of viewers who crave deep, cinematic crime documentaries just like this one. Because today, we're entering USP Allenwood, the high-security complex known as the Silent Giant. And once we step inside, nothing will sound the same. Tucked between the rolling forests of Union County, Pennsylvania, lies a structure that feels completely out of place. Drive far enough down the two-lane rural roads, past quiet farms, old barns, and sleepy towns, and you eventually see it rise from the tree line. USP Allenwood, a massive concrete island designed to be as silent as the land around it. That silence is not accidental. It's engineered. When Allenwood was completed in 1993, the Bureau of Prisons built it with one idea in mind: contain the men the system feared most. Not the petty criminals. Not the impulsive offenders. But the ones who engineered escapes, who led gangs, who manipulated power like chess pieces, who could turn any weakness into an opportunity. And unlike the supermax at Florence, where prisoners are buried in permanent isolation, Allenwood had a different philosophy. Control the body, shape the environment, and let the mind reveal itself. The prison was built like a wheel, with a central hub and spokes that radiate outward. Someone standing at the exact center can see down multiple movement corridors at once, creating a sense of omnipresence. It isn't loud. It isn't chaotic. It's structured, balanced, almost unnervingly calm. Inside, the air is thick with a strange contradiction, tension without noise. Guards don't shout commands, they speak in clipped, controlled tones. Prisoners move in lines so straight they almost feel rehearsed. Even the yard, surrounded by razor wire and armed towers, has an eerie order to it. Every prison has a feel, and Allenwood's is unmistakable. Stillness. Stillness that sits in the bones. Stillness that whispers that eyes are always watching. Stillness that can swallow a scream before it ever forms. If you talk to correctional officers who spent years here, they'll tell you the same thing. Allenwood is dangerous, but not like people expect. It's not the chaotic danger of stabbings every other day or open warfare between gangs. Instead, it's a quiet danger, the kind that builds pressure over weeks, months, years. The kind that erupts only when the timing is perfect and the consequences are unavoidable. One officer who worked here from 1995 to 2012 described the place with a sentence that has stuck with me ever since. Allenwood doesn't explode. It waits. This waiting sensation runs through the entire complex. The housing units tower with concrete walls, echoing the footsteps of men who have walked the same short distances thousands of times. Every window is narrow, every angle calculated, every blind spot eliminated. The recreation yard is watched by two sniper towers, each with a direct line of sight to the other. Even the outdoor benches are bolted down with thick steel anchors. The BOP wanted a fortress. They got one. But behind the structure, behind the routine, behind the layers of security and the sterile quiet, there is something else. Something human. Because every prison, no matter how fortified, is a machine powered by people. And inside Allenwood, those people create stories the public rarely hears. Stories of alliances formed through necessity. Stories of gang leaders whose influence extended far beyond the fences. Stories of men who arrived here broken, violent, or uncontrollable and became something else entirely. And stories of those who never left the prison alive. Allenwood's silence hides all of it. But if you walk long enough through the facility, if you listen closely, if you pay attention to the patterns in the noise, or the lack of it, you start to understand why USP Allenwood earned its nickname. The Silent Giant. Because giants don't roar. They don't need to. Their presence alone is enough to shake the ground. This chapter is only the beginning. If the architecture of USP Allenwood is engineered silence, then the inmates inside it are the thunder that never fully breaks. Every man housed within its walls arrived with a reputation, some earned, some exaggerated, but all taken seriously. And for the officers who walked those corridors every day, their job wasn't just to control bodies. It was to understand who held power, who pretended to, and who was willing to bleed to prove it. In Allenwood, violence didn't always start with a shout. Sometimes it started with the scrape of a chair. A glance held 1 second too long. A whispered message in a chow hall line. Every movement could be a signal, every silence a warning. This wasn't a prison where raw strength made you dangerous. It was one where strategy, alliances, and information mattered far more. To understand Allenwood, you had to understand the men who shaped its rhythm, leaders who didn't simply follow gang codes, but rewrote them to survive in a facility where a mistake could end a life in seconds. There was Reynaldo Ghost Madera, a man whose nickname wasn't given lightly. He had a habit of appearing where no one expected, quiet in the yard, unnoticed in the chapel, invisible in conversations until he chose not to be. Ghost had served time in multiple high-security prisons before landing in Allenwood, each transfer the result of either a conflict or, more often, a political calculation made by officials who didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't physically imposing, lean, tattooed, and solitary, but Ghost understood people with unnerving precision. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he acted. Within a year of arriving, he had influence across groups that normally never communicated without violence. Not because of fear, but because of information. Ghost knew things. Things inmates whispered when they thought no one heard. Things staff said in frustration under their breath. Things that arrived on kites, coded messages, and hidden signals. There were days Ghost seemed to know what was happening before the prison itself did. On the opposite end of the spectrum was Marcus Redline Halford, a man whose presence vibrated like a taut wire pulled too tight. Taller, heavier, and built like a linebacker, Redline was known for never stepping backward, not even in situations where doing so might save his life. He was respected, feared, and unbelievably disciplined. His criminal past involved robberies, but his reputation inside revolved around one thing: control. Redline didn't allow his people to act out of emotion. Emotion, he once told another inmate, is how you get buried in here. And he wasn't wrong. In Allenwood, impulsive men didn't last long. Then there was Jensen Boyd, known by both inmates and officers as the Professor. He wasn't part of a gang. He wasn't a fighter. But he was something else, a strategist with a mind that could break down the social structure of the prison like a mathematician analyzing a formula. Arrested for fraud, conspiracy, and white-collar crimes that cost corporations millions, Boyd had no business being surrounded by murderers, gang leaders, and violent offenders. And yet, he adapted with unsettling ease. He learned quickly that gangs weren't just collections of men, they were political systems. Trade networks. Information channels. Boyd mapped them with the precision of a scientist. His notebooks, confiscated twice by staff, were filled with diagrams, signals, schedules, power hierarchies, and predictions. Some inmates ignored him, assuming his intelligence made him harmless. Others understood the truth. In a place like Allenwood, knowledge was a weapon sharper than steel. But the silent giant wasn't shaped only by inmates. Correctional officers, too, played their part. Officers who worked day after day in that atmosphere of tension learned to read the smallest cues: a slight shift in body language, a change in yard patterns, a rumor carried from unit to unit. One officer, known simply as Hawthorne, had become a myth among inmates. Tall, weathered, unshakably calm, Hawthorne had walked Allenwood's corridors for decades. He wasn't feared because he was harsh, he was feared because he noticed everything. A tattoo no one had seen before? He saw it. A new handshake between inmates from rival crews? He made a mental note. Two prisoners who normally hated each other suddenly sitting at the same table? Hawthorne would quietly alert his team and watch the next 72 hours like a hawk. He once told a rookie officer, "In here, danger doesn't walk up and introduce itself. It whispers." Hawthorne understood something critical. Allenwood didn't function by brute force alone. It survived because of balance. Prisoners had to feel seen, but never cornered. Officers had to enforce, but never escalate without purpose. Any shift, no matter how small, could break that balance and send the organization spiraling into violence. And so every day at Allenwood became a delicate dance. A ritual of order in a place built to contain the most unpredictable men in the country. What made these individuals, Ghost, Redline, the Professor, Hawthorne, so important wasn't their strength or intelligence alone. It was the collision of their personalities, their motives, and their survival instincts. Their presence created an ecosystem unlike any other federal prison. A place where every choice mattered. Every silence carried weight. Every alliance meant something. And as we move deeper into Allenwood's hidden history, we'll uncover the moment when that delicate balance finally cracked and the silent giant proved that even stillness can become the loudest warning of all. 4 years, USP Allenwood existed in a strange, almost unnatural equilibrium. Violence happened, yes, but it happened quietly, surgically, strategically. Things rarely spiraled. Crises rarely exploded. Officers used to joke that Allenwood wasn't just high security, it was high order, a place where the most dangerous men in the system followed a rhythm even they couldn't fully explain. But in every prison, no matter how controlled, there comes a moment when the rhythm changes. And at Allenwood, the shift didn't begin with a riot, a stabbing, or a dramatic confrontation in the yard. It began with a transfer. Just one man. One name on a piece of paperwork that looked like every other. His arrival was so quiet it almost passed unnoticed. Almost. His name was Darius Vance, and his presence would become the spark that lit a fuse buried deep within the silent giant. The arrival. It was a crisp morning in late September when Vance stepped off the transport bus, hands cuffed, ankles chained, face calm in a way that made the officers stiffen. Some inmates walk into a new facility already scanning for weaknesses. Others walk in terrified, unsure of the hierarchy. But Vance, he walked like he had been here before, even though he hadn't. A handful of Allenwood's most observant inmates watched through their slit-sized windows, noting the details. Vance didn't look physically imposing. He wasn't covered in tattoos. He didn't posture or stare down the officers. But he walked with intent. Focused. Centered. The kind of intent that shifted the air around him. Ghost Madare noticed it first. From his vantage point in the unit's second-tier day room, Ghost watched Vance enter processing. He didn't react outwardly, but inside his mind he began connecting threads that others didn't even see. Transfers like this weren't random. Allenwood didn't receive men like Vance without a reason. Ghost had a habit of listening to the smallest clues in the staff conversations, the rumors carried between units, the unexpected changes in movement schedules. And in the week leading up to Vance's arrival, the prison had changed in subtle but telling ways. Units were cleaned more thoroughly. Searches became more detailed. Yard rotations were adjusted. And Hawthorne, the unshakable officer, was spending more time in central control than usual. Something was coming. And now Ghost could see it had arrived. Why Vance mattered. Darius Vance wasn't a gang leader. He wasn't a political radical. He wasn't even a career criminal in the traditional sense. But he had done something worse, something that made him a target in every prison he entered. Vance had exposed a multi-state drug pipeline run by a powerful syndicate that operated both inside and outside the federal system. His cooperation led to indictments, asset seizures, and multiple arrests, some of which involved men currently serving time in Allenwood. He wasn't just a snitch. He was the snitch. The kind whose testimony moved federal judges, crippled criminal enterprises, and made dangerous men furious enough to wait years for revenge. Allenwood wasn't supposed to get inmates like Vance. He was a high-risk target, a walking magnet for violence. Normally, someone like him would be placed in protective custody, or in a communication-restricted unit like ADX Florence. But for reasons no one understood, Vance had been cleared for general population. To Ghost, that meant only one thing. This wasn't a mistake, he whispered to himself. Someone wants him here. The first shift. The prison's atmosphere began to change the moment Vance entered the unit. Men who normally laughed, played cards, or debated sports suddenly became quiet. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye tracked Vance as he claimed an empty bunk. Redline Halford, the disciplined strategist, kept his crew in formation. No moves, he warned. No talk. No reactions. His voice carried a finality that told everyone the rule was non-negotiable. But prison politics don't wait for orders. And in Allenwood, even a rumor could move faster than a blade. Before Vance even finished unpacking, whispers were weaving through the cells. "He's the one who testified in Philly. Nah, that's the dude who flipped on Vasquez's people. Man, if that's who I think it is, someone's gonna die." And everywhere those whispers went, tension followed like a shadow. The officer's perspective. Officer Hawthorne noticed the change by lunchtime. Prisons have atmospheres, the intangible pulse that only seasoned officers can read. Sometimes it feels electric. Sometimes dull. Sometimes restless. But today, Allenwood felt like the seconds before a thunderstorm, charged with pressure waiting to break. Hawthorne didn't need a file to understand what was happening. He saw it in the way inmates positioned themselves. He heard it in the unusual quiet of the Chow Hall. He sensed it in the way Ghost was watching the room, eyes moving, expression unreadable. He told the lieutenant, "Eyes on C-block today. Something's shifting." The lieutenant shrugged. "Just a new guy. It'll normalize." But Hawthorne knew better. In a place like Allenwood, one wrong transfer wasn't an inconvenience. It was a catalyst. The decision. That evening, as the unit settled into nighttime stillness, Ghost approached Redline casually, slow steps, no sudden movements, no signals that could draw attention. "We need to talk," Ghost murmured. Redline didn't look at him. "We're not touching the guy," he said. "Doesn't matter who he snitched on." Ghost waited a beat before responding. "That's not the issue." Redline turned his head slightly. "Then what is?" Ghost's eyes shifted toward Vance's cell. "He shouldn't be here. And if the feds put him in this unit, not PC, not SHU, not isolation, then something bigger is happening." Redline didn't argue. He understood immediately. A placement like this wasn't accident. It was message. A test. Or a trap. And whether inmates liked it or not, this one man, Darius Vance, had become the center of a storm forming inside the silent giant. The balance that had held Allenwood steady for years was beginning to tilt. And the prison was about to reveal what happened when silence didn't break, but shifted. The first night Darius Vance slept inside the general population unit of USP Allenwood, nobody else truly slept. Even men who snored through cell extractions, lockdowns, and midnight counts found themselves lying awake, listening, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No shouts. No alarms. No sudden bursts of violence. Just silence. And somehow, that was worse. Because Allenwood wasn't quiet anymore. It was watching. The new variable. Ghost spent the night thinking. Not pacing, thinking. He lay on his bunk, one arm behind his head, eyes open, following a trail of logic only he could see. Vance wasn't just a threat because of his past. He was a threat because of what his presence represented. Placement in general population didn't happen by accident. Too many signatures. Too many protocols. Too many risk assessments designed specifically to prevent this exact situation. Someone higher up wanted Vance visible. Accessible. Vulnerable. But Ghost wasn't convinced the target was Vance himself. Sometimes the bait wasn't the prey. Sometimes it was the trap. Morning movements. The morning brought tension into focus. When the doors rolled at 6 a.m. for chow, inmates filed out with precision, but everyone's eyes drifted toward Vance. Not directly. Never directly. No one wanted to be seen watching him. But every man in the unit, from the shot callers to the loners, made mental calculations. Who was going to make the first move? When would it happen? And who would suffer the consequences? Prisons ran on routine, but today the routine felt strained. Redline Halford's crew normally moved through chow like a unit, close enough to signal unity, far enough to avoid suspicion. Today, Redline adjusted the formation subtly, splitting his men across the line. It was a defensive posture disguised as a logistical choice. Ghost sat alone, as he often did. Calm. Observing. He watched Vance navigate the line slowly, carefully, like someone aware he was walking through a minefield. Then something unusual happened. When Vance reached the cutlery area, a fork slipped from another inmate's tray, clattering loudly on the steel countertop. The inmate froze. Every man at the table tensed. Vance bent down to pick it up. This simple motion, just a man bending to pick up a fork, made the entire chow hall shift. For a moment, it felt like time stretched thin, waiting for the first spark. But Vance stood up calmly, handed the fork back, and continued walking. That was the moment Ghost knew two things. Vance wasn't oblivious. He was dangerous in a way that didn't involve weapons. The call from the tower. Later that morning, Officer Hawthorne received a quiet request through his radio. "Lieutenant wants to see you. Now." Hawthorne rarely got summoned mid-shift. That alone signaled that something had escalated behind the scenes. He made his way to the administrative wing, where the lieutenant sat behind a desk filled with paperwork that looked recently disturbed. "You've seen the new arrival?" the lieutenant asked. Hawthorne nodded. "Thoughts?" Hawthorne paused. "Units tense. Too tense for a normal transfer." The lieutenant leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "Warden says it's temporary. Administrative oversight, he claims." Hawthorne didn't react. Both men knew that phrase was a lie. "Look," the lieutenant continued, "we're not getting the whole picture. But the warden made it clear, Vance stays in Gen Pop unless something extreme happens." Hawthorne absorbed that. "So," he said quietly, "you want me to prevent the extreme." The lieutenant exhaled. "I want you to watch for the extreme. We can't stop every bad decision inmates make. But if something's brewing, make sure we're ahead of it." Hawthorne didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already understood that trouble wasn't brewing. Trouble had arrived. The unexpected alliance. Back in the yard, something even stranger was happening. Vance was sitting alone on one of the concrete benches, head down, reading a book. That alone wasn't strange, lots of men minded their own business on their first days. What was strange was what happened next. The professor, Jensen Boyd, approached him. Boyd was the type of inmate who rarely took social risks. He avoided interactions that complicated his daily routines. He never inserted himself into political matters. And he definitely didn't approach high-risk inmates. But today, he walked straight toward Vance and sat down on the bench beside him. Ghost, Redline, and half the yard noticed immediately. If Boyd had simply been making small talk, that would have been odd. But Boyd wasn't a small talk kind of man. He opened with a question that carried its own weight. "You know why you're here, right?" Vance closed the book slowly. "I have theories." Boyd nodded. "Good. You're going to need them." Ghost watched carefully. Something in Boyd's posture was different. Less casual. More calculated. Boyd wasn't aligning with Vance out of charity. He was aligning out of necessity. Because Boyd had realized something Ghost already suspected. If Vance was the bait, then the real target wasn't him. The real target was whoever touched him. Boyd leaned closer, speaking softly. "Listen carefully. Everyone here wants to know one thing. Did you come alone?" Vance didn't respond immediately. Then he answered with a sentence that landed like a dropped blade. "No one like me ever arrives alone." Boyd froze. Ghost's eyes narrowed from across the yard. Redline's knuckles tightened slightly. Vance wasn't a random transfer. He was the beginning of something else. Something larger. Something orchestrated. A new pressure on the silent giant. That night, the prison felt different again. The tension wasn't just noticeable, it was multiplying. Conversations shifted from curiosity to strategy. From fear to calculation. The prison was splitting into two camps. Those who wanted Vance gone immediately, and those who sensed danger in touching him. It was rare to see Allenwood torn in this way. Even rarer to see men like Ghost and Redline quietly preparing for the possibility that something bigger, something federal, was in motion. Inside the walls of the silent giant, pressure was building. Not explosive pressure. Not impulsive pressure. But the kind that changes the shape of everything around it. Allenwood was no longer simply waiting. It was adjusting. rebalancing, preparing. Because when silence changes, it doesn't warn you. It transforms you. Cracks in a high-security prison never start with a riot. Not at Allenwood. Not in a place designed so precisely that even chaos has to ask permission before it enters. Cracks start with patterns, tiny deviations in the daily rhythm, the kind only the sharpest minds notice. And during the days following Darius Vance's arrival, the patterns at USP Allenwood began to shift, one subtle tick at a time. Men who normally walked the yard in predictable loops now drifted unpredictably. Card games usually dominated by the same crews started breaking apart. Even the noise in the unit changed, less conversation, more whispers, more silence inside the silence. Allenwood wasn't tense anymore. It was changing. And that change was the crack. The book that didn't belong. On the third morning after Vance arrived, Ghost was making his usual observations from the second tier when something unusual caught his eye. A book. Tiny detail. Easy to miss. But in Allenwood, easy-to-miss details mattered most. Vance was reading again, but not the same book he had yesterday, or the day before. Vance's first two books had been standard issue, worn novels passed around the unit countless times. But today he was holding something different. A clean, unscuffed book. New. Too new. Books didn't just appear in Allenwood. They passed through hands, through staff, through units. They carried wear, creases, smudges, folded corners, traces of fingerprints and time. New books meant one thing. Someone on the outside wanted Vance to have it. Ghost shifted slightly on the railing, narrowing his eyes. Even from a distance he could see the lack of stamps, the absence of the property of BOP mark, the untouched spine. And that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was the title. Negotiating Hostile Environments. Not a book. A message. Ghost didn't say anything. Not yet. But deep inside his mind, where he stored the data of this prison like an ever-changing map, he added another pin to the board. Something was being set in motion. Officer Hawthorne's observation. Meanwhile, Hawthorne had begun tracking Vance in his own way. He didn't hover. He didn't question. He simply watched. That morning, he noticed another shift, small, but telling. When Vance finished breakfast in the chow hall, instead of walking directly out with the other inmates, he slowed just enough to glance toward the CO desk. Not long enough to make it obvious. Just long enough to know that Hawthorne saw it. A glance like that could mean many things. A request for protection. A strategic signal. Or something more dangerous. A test. Hawthorne didn't react. No nod. No acknowledgement. Just a mental note placed quietly in the back of his mind. When the lieutenant approached minutes later asking for updates, Hawthorne responded in his typical calm tone. The crack started. The lieutenant frowned. What crack? Hawthorne didn't look away from the yard. The one nobody sees until it breaks open. Redline's calculations. Redline Halford was a creature of habit. Structure. Rules. Every decision he made inside Allenwood followed the same principle. If it didn't serve survival, it wasn't worth doing. And yet, even Redline found himself studying Vance more than he liked. Not because Vance posed a physical threat, but because Vance disrupted predictability, and unpredictability got people killed. That afternoon, Redline called a quiet meeting in the laundry room, a place where cameras caught only half the angles, and guards rarely hovered. His crew gathered around him, disciplined, silent, waiting. "We're not touching him," Redline said immediately. A few grumbled. One asked, "Even if someone else does?" Redline nodded. "Especially if someone else does." He leaned against the industrial dryer, voice low, eyes focused. "Someone wants him here. Someone wants a reaction. We move on him, we're doing somebody else's work." Another man spoke. "Here's a snitch. There's rules." Redline's response was sharp. "There's also survival. If he's here to bait a hit, the first man who swings isn't killing him, he's killing all of us." The room went silent. Redline wasn't just protecting Vance. He was protecting Allenwood from a chain reaction that could burn the entire prison down. The professor connects the dots. Jensen Boyd, the professor, watched the entire prison shift like an equation with variables suddenly changing. He noticed the new book, the altered movement patterns, the sudden administrative silence from above, the guards walking with a hint of tension, the inmates watching each other more than usual. He even noticed something Ghost hadn't yet pieced together. One of the phones on the yard had a wire replaced, new copper, clean cuts. Phones didn't get new wiring randomly. It meant someone was preparing for monitored calls. Or avoiding them. Either way, it was another crack. The professor approached Ghost in the rec cage later that day. They weren't friends, but they respected each other in a way only two men who saw everything could. "You see the book?" Boyd asked. Ghost didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I saw." "Then you know what it means." Ghost nodded slowly. "It means Vance isn't the mission. Here's the message." The professor swallowed. "That's what I'm afraid of. Cracks in a high-security prison never start with a riot. Not at Allenwood. Not in a place designed so precisely that even chaos has to ask permission before it enters. Cracks start with patterns, tiny deviations in the daily rhythm, the kind only the sharpest minds notice. And during the days following Darius Vance's arrival, the patterns at USP Allenwood began to shift, one subtle tick at a time. Men who normally walked the yard in predictable loops now drifted unpredictably. Card games usually dominated by the same crews started breaking apart. Even the noise in the unit changed, less conversation, more whispers, more silence inside the silence. Allenwood wasn't tense anymore. It was changing. And that change was the crack. The book that didn't belong. On the third morning after Vance arrived, Ghost was making his usual observations from the second tier when something unusual caught his eye. A book. Tiny detail. Easy to miss. But in Allenwood, easy-to-miss details mattered most. Vance was reading again, but not the same book he had yesterday, or the day before. Vance's first two books had been standard issue, worn novels passed around the unit countless times. But today he was holding something different. A clean, unscuffed book. New. Too new. Books didn't just appear in Allenwood. They passed through hands, through staff, through units. They carried wear, creases, smudges, folded corners, traces of fingerprints and time. New books meant one thing. Someone on the outside wanted Vance to have it. Ghost shifted slightly on the railing, narrowing his eyes. Even from a distance he could see the lack of stamps, the absence of the property of BOP mark, the untouched spine. And that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was the title. Negotiating Hostile Environments. Not a book. A message. Ghost didn't say anything. Not yet. But deep inside his mind, where he stored the data of this prison like an ever-changing map, he added another pin to the board. Something was being set in motion. Officer Hawthorne's observation. Meanwhile, Hawthorne had begun tracking Vance in his own way. He didn't hover. He didn't question. He simply watched. That morning, he noticed another shift, small, but telling. When Vance finished breakfast in the chow hall, instead of walking directly out with the other inmates, he slowed just enough to glance toward the CO desk. Not long enough to make it obvious. Just long enough to know that Hawthorne saw it. A glance like that could mean many things. A request for protection. A strategic signal. Or something more dangerous. A test. Hawthorne didn't react. No nod. No acknowledgement. Just a mental note placed quietly in the back of his mind. When the lieutenant approached minutes later asking for updates, Hawthorne responded in his typical calm tone. The crack started. The lieutenant frowned. What crack? Hawthorne didn't look away from the yard. The one nobody sees until it breaks open. Redline's calculations. Redline Halford was a creature of habit. Structure. Rules. Every decision he made inside Allenwood followed the same principle. If it didn't serve survival, it wasn't worth doing. And yet, even Redline found himself studying Vance more than he liked. Not because Vance posed a physical threat, but because Vance disrupted predictability, and unpredictability got people killed. That afternoon, Redline called a quiet meeting in the laundry room, a place where cameras caught only half the angles, and guards rarely hovered. His crew gathered around him, disciplined, silent, waiting. "We're not touching him," Redline said immediately. A few grumbled. One asked, "Even if someone else does?" Redline nodded. "Especially if someone else does." He leaned against the industrial dryer, voice low, eyes focused. "Someone wants him here. Someone wants a reaction. We move on him, we're doing somebody else's work." Another man spoke. "He's a snitch. There's rules." Redline's response was sharp. "There's also survival. If he's here to bait a hit, the first man who swings isn't killing him, he's killing all of us." The room went silent. Redline wasn't just protecting Vance. He was protecting Allenwood from a chain reaction that could burn the entire prison down. The professor connects the dots. Jensen Boyd, the professor, watched the entire prison shift like an equation with variables suddenly changing. He noticed the new book, the altered movement patterns, the sudden administrative silence from above, the guards walking with a hint of tension, the inmates watching each other more than usual. He even noticed something Ghost hadn't yet pieced together. One of the phones on the yard had a wire replaced, new copper, clean cuts. Phones didn't get new wiring randomly. It meant someone was preparing for monitored calls. Or avoiding them. Either way, it was another crack. The professor approached Ghost in the rec cage later that day. They weren't friends, but they respected each other in a way only two men who saw everything could. "You see the book?" Boyd asked. Ghost didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I saw." "Then you know what it means." Ghost nodded slowly. "It means Vance isn't the mission. He's the message." The professor swallowed. "That's what I'm afraid of." The first attempt, subtle, almost invisible. Just before evening count, the first attempt happened. Not a hit. Not an attack. Not even a confrontation. Something quieter. More calculated. As Vance walked toward his cell, a folded note slid under his door. No one saw who sent it. No one saw who delivered it. It moved through the unit like a whisper, fast, unseen, designed to disappear. Vance picked it up, unfolded it. And Ghost watched from above as the expression on Vance's face changed ever so slightly. Not fear. Not confusion. Not anger. Recognition. Vance scanned the tier instinctively, not searching for who sent it, but confirming who already knew. Ghost didn't look away. Their eyes met for the first time since Vance arrived. And in that single second of locked gaze, Ghost finally understood something none of the others had realized. The crack wasn't in Allenwood. The crack was inside Vance. Someone had sent him here with unfinished business. Someone had given him a message. And whatever was written on that note, it wasn't a threat. It was a signal. A signal that the silent giant was about to awaken. The walls of Allenwood stand quiet now, but their silence speaks louder than any riot, any escape attempt, any headline ever could. Behind those fences, men continue to walk the narrow line between order and chaos, redemption and ruin. Some will leave these gates one day, others never will. But all of them remain part of a story most Americans will never see, a story built on power, control, discipline, and the constant struggle for survival inside the system's most unforgiving corridors. And as long as prisons like Allenwood exist, questions will linger. How much control is enough? How much isolation is too much? And who truly pays the price for the order we demand? If this deep dive into Allenwood's hidden world opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe, like, and turn on notifications, because we're far from done. More untold stories, more hidden truths, more journeys inside America's most dangerous institutions are coming. This has been The Silent Giant. Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and stay safe.